You're eating maggots, how do they taste?
In 1987, the Lost Boys arrived and quietly did something few people recognized at the time. It redefined the image of the vampire for an entire generation. Before this film, vampires were usually ancient, elegant, gloomy creatures standing far away from teen culture. Then Joel Schumacher threw all of that into the Santa Cruz night, dressed them in leather jackets, spiked hair, motorcycles, rock music, and a look that made you want to run away and follow them at the same time. On screen, this was a cool, seductive, rebellious vampire movie. But behind the fog, the saxophone, and those glowing eyes, the making of it was far messier than the polished surface audiences saw. The famous flying scenes were actually born from budget limitations. The vampire contact lenses looked hypnotic on camera, but in real life, they were almost torture. And while the movie was slowly becoming a cult icon, it also unintentionally placed its two youngest teen stars into an orbit of fame they would never truly escape. Today, we're going back to Santa Carla to uncover 20 of the strangest, darkest, and most unforgettable facts about the Lost Boys. The movie that didn't just create a new generation of vampires, but turned eternal youth into the most beautiful invitation of all, and the most dangerous. Number 1. The Lost Boys almost started out as the Goonies with vampires. If you only look at the finished film, it's hard to believe that The Lost Boys was never originally meant to become such a seductive, rebellious, haunting vampire movie. In its earliest development stage, it was much closer to a kid's adventure than a teenage nightmare. Imagine a version where the main characters were much younger, carrying flashlights into the dark, facing vampires as if they were stepping into a nighttime adventure in the style of the Goonies. That was the original framework of this project. In other words, The Lost Boys was once nothing like the movie we know today. It didn't yet have the glossy leather jackets, the motorcycles racing through the night, the dangerous sensual atmosphere, or the youthful vampires who felt both threatening and irresistible. In that early version, the vampires were older, uglier, and much more classical, closer to Nosferatu than to the counterculture icons of the 1980s. The real turning point came when Richard Donner was no longer continuing with the project, and Joel Schumacher stepped in. That was the moment The Lost Boys was not simply revised, but almost reborn. Schumacher saw more in the story than a children's adventure. He saw youth, desire, temptation, power, and moral drift. He aged the characters up into teenagers and made everything more dangerous, sexier, and less predictable. From that moment on, the movie was no longer about hunting monsters. It became a story about how deeply youth can be seduced by darkness. But the fact that this movie almost became a children's adventure still wasn't the biggest turn of all. The person who truly made The Lost Boys dangerous, seductive, and immortal is the next figure in the story. Number 2. Joel Schumacher didn't just direct this movie, he reinvented it. A lot of people think a director's greatest contribution is simply shooting beautifully or casting the right actors. But with The Lost Boys, Joel Schumacher's role went much further than that. He didn't just show up to point the camera. He came in to decide what this movie was actually going to be. And the difference between those two versions is almost like day and night. When Schumacher read the project, he immediately realized the core idea was powerful. Children or teenagers getting pulled into a vampire world where growing up and becoming corrupted almost become the same thing. But he also understood that if the film kept its original safe, adventure-driven tone, it would quickly drift by as a cute enough entertainment product and then disappear. He didn't want that. He wanted something bolder, sexier, more dangerous, and far more distinctive. So Schumacher began restructuring it. He turned the movie into an 80s goth pop fever dream, where the boardwalk was no longer a place for family fun, but something closer to a glittering trap. In that world, the music wasn't there as decoration. It lured people in. The style wasn't there just to look good, it created its own spell. And the vampires were no longer ancient creatures standing apart from humanity. They became exaggerated versions of rebellious youth, prettier, freer, wilder, and more dangerous than anyone naive enough to get close to them. And once Joel Schumacher had reshaped the soul of the movie, he needed something even more important: a world vivid enough for audiences to believe this darkness could exist in real life. Number 3. Santa Carla isn't just a fictional name. It's a distorted version of a real place. It's no accident that Santa Carla always feels like a real place that's somehow rotten from the inside out. It's the kind of town that makes you want to walk in, while also feeling like you won't come out whole if you stay too long. Santa Carla is really the cinematic shadow of Santa Cruz, California, where the movie was filmed. But instead of using the real name, the filmmakers chose a fake one that sounded close enough to spark recognition, yet strange enough to create distance. This wasn't just a practical decision, it was a very smart one. Because once Santa Cruz became Santa Carla, the film could drag that entire setting further into darkness, distortion, and danger without being tied too tightly to the real-world image of the place. That's why Santa Carla feels so unusual. It doesn't feel like a fantasy world detached from everyday life. It feels like real life that has been infected. The boardwalk is still lit up, the music is still playing, teenagers are still hanging around, the ocean is still there. But behind everything familiar, something hungry is hiding. Number 4. The famous vampire flying scenes were actually born out of lack. The strange thing is that one of the scariest sensations in The Lost Boys was created not by excess, but by limitation. The film's famous flying vampire sequences were, in the end, born from the fact that the production simply couldn't do everything in the most lavish way possible. If this had been an extremely wealthy project, they probably would have tried to stage full flying scenes that clearly showed bodies, wires, movement, and effects. But The Lost Boys went another way. Instead of showing off the monster, it turned the camera itself into the monster. The forward-thrusting point of view, the sudden burst of speed, the sound of wind, and the feeling of space being torn open make the audience feel as if they're inside the mind of a predator, or worse, directly beneath its claws. But if you think budget struggles were the most memorable part of making The Lost Boys, wait until a certain face steps in and tilts the entire movie toward darkness. Number 5. Kiefer Sutherland didn't need to yell to become the movie's most memorable monster. In a film full of music, light, and imagery designed to flaunt its own allure, the scariest person in it is the one who almost never seems to do too much. David doesn't burst onto the screen. He simply appears. And from that moment on, the heartbeat of the entire film changes. David doesn't appear like a classic vampire from older cinema. He isn't formal, overly aristocratic, or like some monster from a distant castle. He feels more like the leader of a teenage pack of predators. Handsome, confident, quiet, dangerous, with that deadly coolness that makes his victims step closer instead of running away. That's what Kiefer Sutherland does so brilliantly in this movie. He doesn't need to stuff the character with endless dialogue to prove his power. With just a look, a thin smile, a certain way of standing, a silence held a little too long, David feels like the one person who understands the rules better than everyone else in the frame. He doesn't shout because he doesn't have to. The world of Santa Carla already seems tilted in his favor. And that's also when people begin to realize something clearly. The glamorous surface of The Lost Boys was never built out of ease. It was built out of risky choices, where one small misstep could have turned the movie into something completely different. Number 6. Jason Patric once didn't believe this movie would succeed. Looking back now, Michael feels like such a natural part of The Lost Boys. But what's interesting is that this sense of certainty didn't always exist at the beginning. For a young actor like Jason Patric, the script must have looked difficult to pin down. A vampire movie, but not fully horror. A teen movie, but not following the usual romantic formula. Something funny, seductive, and drenched in MTV-style energy that not everybody would immediately understand. But that's exactly what makes the film interesting. Beneath all that strange surface material, Joel Schumacher saw something deeply human. A young man moving to a strange place, getting drawn into a mysterious group, being tempted by power and by the feeling of belonging, then slowly losing himself. Viewed that way, Michael isn't just the lead of a vampire movie. He becomes a portrait of youth being pulled off center. A lot of films like this don't look great right away. On set, they can feel weird, loose, unpredictable, even enough to make the people involved doubt them. But then, they meet the right audience at the right time, and suddenly everything locks together. The Lost Boys is a perfect example of that type of project, one where not everyone making it can recognize what they're actually creating. Number 7. The two Coreys were almost stamped with their fate from here on. Today, when people think of the 1980s, the phrase "the two Coreys" almost automatically pops into many minds. But every cultural brand has an origin point, and The Lost Boys was one of the defining moments that cemented the bond between Corey Haim and Corey Feldman in the public imagination. On screen, they bring two very different energies that complement each other perfectly. Haim has a softness, vulnerability, and relatability that makes the audience believe Sam's fear. Feldman is sharper, more confident, with that kid trying to be a warrior quality that fits the comic book energy of the Frog Brothers. Put them together in a movie with as much personality as the Lost Boys, and they stop being just two young actors. They become a duo the industry can package and sell. And that is exactly what happened later. What was taking shape on screen wasn't just the charming chemistry of two teen stars. It was the beginning of a brand, a kind of spotlight, and a burden no child could fully understand the long-term consequences of. And what's worse is that the Lost Boys didn't just create icons on screen. It also unintentionally opened up an orbit that the people inside it would need many years, even a lifetime, to fully look back on. Number 8. It took decades for some of them to accept they had been part of a legend. This is one of the things I love most when looking back at cult films. The people who make them don't always understand right away what they've created. From inside the set, everything can feel like just a shooting schedule. Makeup, exhaustion, difficult scenes, and constant uncertainty about whether the movie is even working. But from the outside, audiences are slowly building an entirely separate life for it. The Lost Boys is exactly that kind of movie. It took years, after repeated viewings, endless quotations, and affection passed down across generations, for some of the people involved to begin seeing it differently. It was no longer just an 80s teen vampire movie, but a work with a genuine legacy, a cultural landmark, a cornerstone in the way mainstream cinema reinvented the vampire for modern audiences. Number 9. The kind of thing no soundstage can fake. You can build a fake street, you can build a fake beach, you can even build an entire fake town, but it's incredibly hard to fake the chaotic, slightly dirty, both alluring and unsettling energy of a real seaside boardwalk at night. And the Lost Boys understood that. That's why when the movie brought its story into the real Santa Cruz boardwalk, it captured something that production design alone would have had trouble reproducing: the breathing pulse of real life. The lights, the signs, the crowds, the noise, the weary excitement, the slightly out-of-control feeling of a beach town at night all make Santa Carla never look too polished. It feels alive. And because it feels alive, it also feels more dangerous. What's great is that the movie doesn't try to make the location too clean or too smooth. It lets the ugly corners, the dark pockets, the strange faces, and the mixed-up atmosphere do their work. So when the vampires appear, they don't feel like creatures ripping apart a peaceful world. They feel like something that has always belonged there. That is an incredibly smart choice, because a movie about temptation always works better when evil doesn't fall in from outer space. It grows out of the very environment that made people lower their guard. Number 10. Simple-looking scenes came at the cost of real endurance. One of cinema's biggest illusions is that the more effortless a scene looks on screen, the more audiences assume it must have been easy to shoot. But with The Lost Boys, that wasn't always true. The film is remembered for its style, its attitude, its slick coolness, so much so that people forget there was still a long, cold, exhausting production process behind it, full of physical demands that were anything but comfortable, especially for such young actors. This matters because the movie relies heavily on a sense of fragility. When Michael or Sam appears vulnerable, confused, cold, or lost, the film doesn't just need acting. It needs the actors' bodies to truly be in a state of discomfort and exposure. That's the kind of thing audiences may not consciously notice, but they feel it on a subconscious level. And that's why I love facts like this. They remind viewers that cinema isn't just about good ideas, it's also about endurance. Hours under lights, in water, in wind, in the cold, at night, repeating the same action over and over until the emotion lands exactly right. By this point, you can see why this movie was never naturally cool in some effortless way. Behind every glance, every strand of hair, every carefully dark frame was an almost obsessive level of control. Number 11. Control is what made everything look cool. A movie like The Lost Boys can easily create the illusion that everything on screen simply naturally worked. The characters walk into frame and immediately look perfect. The lighting feels just right. The wind feels just right. The hair feels just right. The movements feel just right. But cinema rarely works like magic. Behind that effortless feeling are usually countless extremely precise decisions. That's especially true of the vampires in this movie. They always have to hold two sensations at once, attractive enough to be alluring, and unstable enough that the audience never forgets these are monsters. If the film leaned too far in either direction, they would either become music video models or overdone creatures in heavy makeup. The Lost Boys walks that line beautifully, and that did not happen by accident. Costumes, camera angles, distance from the lens, whether a face stays slightly deeper in shadow or gets kissed by light at just the right moment. All of it helps create the illusion that these vampires belong to the human world and yet don't fully belong to it. That is the real secret behind the movie's brand of cool. Number 12. The tone was fragile and could have collapsed at any moment. One of the most impressive things about The Lost Boys is how well it balances on dangerous ground. This is a vampire movie, but not as heavy as classic horror. It has humor, but never slips fully into parody. It carries teen rebellion, but doesn't become cheap melodrama. It feels sexy, but never loses its sense of threat. Think about it carefully. If the movie had been even a little funnier, it might have turned into camp with no fangs. If it had been even a little more serious, it would have lost the wild, seductive energy that pulled young audiences in. If the visuals had been weaker, it would have looked like just another film chasing the rock and roll aesthetics of the 1980s. And if it had pushed the horror too hard, it would have lost the accessibility that helped turn it into a cult classic. But even with everything so carefully controlled, the film still stood on the edge of an even bigger risk. One wrong tonal step, and all of its magic could have vanished. Number 13. Schumacher didn't just cast actors, he cast attitude. One of the biggest secrets behind the visual success of The Lost Boys is that the movie deeply understands what makes a face haunt an audience. It isn't always dialogue. It isn't always theatrical style acting. Sometimes it's the way a person stands in the light, the way their hair catches the wind, the way they glance to the side as if they always know more than what's being said aloud. Joel Schumacher was especially gifted at that. The vampire gang in The Lost Boys isn't remembered simply because they're monsters. They're remembered because they look like an aesthetic manifesto. Each one feels as if he stepped out of the same rebellious dream. Leather jackets, spiked hair, lean but sharp bodies, an energy that feels both distant and provocative. That's what makes them seem more like a youth cult than an ordinary pack of monsters. That is also why faces like Dwayne still leave an impression without needing much dialogue. They exist through image. And in cinema, that is a major form of power. You don't need to explain a character too much if the moment they enter the frame, the audience already understands. This person belongs to darkness. Number 14. A comic relief side character became a cult icon. If you ask a longtime The Lost Boys fan what they remember most besides David and the vampire gang, a lot of them will immediately mention the Frog Brothers. But what makes those two characters memorable isn't just their screen time. It's the fact that they seem to walk into the movie from a completely different film, and somehow blend perfectly into the world of Santa Carla anyway. If they had been handled too lightly, they would have become nothing more than comic relief. If they had been made too serious, they would have lost their charm. But Corey Feldman and Jameson Newlander pushed them into the most interesting possible zone. Two horror comic-obsessed kids who absolutely believe in vampires and constantly act like they're seasoned monster hunters, even though their teenage immaturity still peeks through. That slight mismatch is what makes them feel alive. The Frog Brothers bring a very specific flavor to the movie. They make this world feel bigger and more colorful. They add comic book action energy without damaging the darker atmosphere. More importantly, they give the audience a point of stability. While the adults around them are clueless or powerless, these two boys who seem like they only read comic books are among the very few people willing to stare directly at the horror unfolding around them. Number 15. The saxophone guy appears briefly and steals the whole movie. Some characters need an entire long arc to become unforgettable. Others only need to step into the frame for a few moments to live forever in pop culture. Tim Capello belongs firmly in the second category. In The Lost Boys, he appears like a pure 80s hallucination, shirtless, muscular, drenched in sweat, wearing chains, standing under purple lights, blowing a saxophone as if he's pouring his entire soul into the performance. In terms of plot, it's just a short scene. But in terms of movie memory, it's an outright robbery. Because from that moment on, the film no longer only has vampires, motorcycles, or David. It also has the saxophone guy. What makes the scene so powerful is that it doesn't feel fake. In real life, Tim Capello was already a true performer, someone who had worked with Tina Turner and possessed exactly the kind of excessive, instinctive, overconfident energy the scene needed. In other words, The Lost Boys didn't create Tim Capello. The movie was simply smart enough to put him on screen at the perfect moment and let the camera capture all of that madness. Number 16. The soundtrack of The Lost Boys became legendary. Some movies have good songs, and then there are movies where the music doesn't just support the images, it becomes half the soul of the entire work. The Lost Boys belongs to the second group. If you strip this movie of its music, especially Cry Little Sister, you're almost tearing away the fog wrapped around its heart. What makes this soundtrack special is that it doesn't just suggest movie atmosphere, it creates its own emotional world. You don't need to see the boardwalk, the motorcycles, or David. The moment the melody begins, Santa Carla almost instantly rises in your mind. Very few movie soundtracks achieve that level of connection. That's why The Lost Boys continues to exist in pop culture, not just as a movie people rewatch, but as a movie people revisit through sound. Its music comes back every Halloween season, every time people grow nostalgic for the 1980s, every time horror fans want to return to that dark but seductive feeling that so few other works have ever recreated. And this is where the film's fate starts to split in two. On one side were critics, still unsure what to do with it. On the other side were audiences, who almost immediately sensed they had found something unlike any vampire movie that had come before. Number 17. Audiences loved it, even if critics didn't fully know what to do with it. Today, calling The Lost Boys an iconic classic feels easy, but when it first came out, things were far less simple. This was the kind of movie that made people who were used to clear genre boundaries feel uncertain. Was it horror? A teen movie? Black comedy? Goth fantasy? An MTV-ized piece of commercial cinema? The answer is, it was a little bit of all of those things. And because of that, not everyone knew how to receive it right away. But there was one group that understood the movie very quickly. Audiences, especially younger audiences. They didn't need it to fit neatly into a box. They only needed it to feel different, stylish, visually unforgettable, and to give them an experience no vampire film before it had offered. The Lost Boys delivered that almost immediately. This is one of the most interesting patterns in film history. A movie does not need every critic to embrace it on day one in order to become legendary. Sometimes it only needs audiences to recognize that it belongs to them first. Number 18. VHS is what truly made The Lost Boys immortal. A lot of good movies simply finish their life cycle once they leave theaters. But for The Lost Boys, theaters were only the starting point. The place where the film truly built its passionate following was in living rooms, during late-night viewings, through endless rewinds on VHS tapes. That's incredibly important if you want to understand why the movie lasted so long. VHS turned watching a movie into something more personal, more ritualistic. You didn't just watch The Lost Boys once and move on. You invited your friends over. You rewound your favorite scene. You memorized lines. You remembered the songs. You remembered the way David looked. You remembered the grandfather's final line. That process of watching it over and over is what carved the movie into collective memory. And a film like The Lost Boys was especially suited to that kind of afterlife. It looked cool enough to make people want to show it off to each other. It had dialogue catchy enough to repeat. It had a soundtrack strong enough to anchor memory. VHS didn't just keep the movie alive, it gave the film time to grow up alongside its audience. But the durability of a cult movie isn't just about people remembering it. It's also about its world continuing to expand, as if the coffin was never fully sealed shut. Number 19. The Lost Boys didn't end when the movie ended. Most cult films continue living in a fairly simple way. Fans re-watch them, quote lines, make posters, wear costumes, and keep the work alive in memory. But The Lost Boys had another path. It expanded its world beyond the original movie through comic books, and that's a very clear sign that this franchise was never truly buried. That matters more than it may seem. Because when a movie keeps being explored through comics, it means fans don't just love it on a nostalgic level. They want to keep living in that world. They want to know what Santa Carla is still hiding. They want to know where those characters went. They want to explore the mythology that the original film only cracked open. With The Lost Boys, the comics became a place where the movie's breath was extended. The cult atmosphere didn't get softened. If anything, it was pushed further, sometimes stranger, sometimes darker. That's when you see the real endurance of a work. When it doesn't just leave behind an ending, but leaves behind a door wide enough for others to keep walking through. And after all the sound, the fog, the mythology, and the aftershocks, the name that must be pulled back to the center is still Joel Schumacher, the man who understood from the beginning what this movie wanted to become. Number 20. Joel Schumacher always saw The Lost Boys as one of his most personal signatures. There are directors who make a successful movie and move on as if it were simply another project on the schedule. But for Joel Schumacher, The Lost Boys was never just a completed assignment. It was a very clear aesthetic statement about the kind of stories he wanted to tell and the way he wanted to tell them. That explains a lot about the movie, why it feels so glossy without being empty, why it feels sensual without becoming cheap, why it is so cool that it almost seems aware of its own coolness, yet still holds on to an emotional core about family, belonging, corruption, and loneliness. Schumacher didn't make The Lost Boys like a standard monster movie. He made it like a fairy tale poisoned by modern youth. So many vampire movies that came afterward borrowed from The Lost Boys. The youthful look, the rebellion, the sensuality, the allure of the group, the feeling of darkness as an invitation. But this 1987 film had already brought all of those elements together almost from the very beginning. And in many ways, that complete mix is Schumacher's signature. The Lost Boys was never just a cool vampire movie from the 1980s. It was a story about youth, temptation, fame, and the price of getting trapped inside a dream so beautiful it becomes poisonous. Maybe that's why, nearly 40 years later, Santa Carla has never truly disappeared into the dark. Out of these 20 facts, which one changed the way you see The Lost Boys the most? Leave a comment below, and if you want me to keep uncovering behind-the-scenes secrets from other classic films, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.